Let's do the case review dance one more time before end of year. We've got another one here that ticks all of the boxes. This is the Lian Li Alpha 550, which launched alongside its smaller Lian Li Alpha 330. We saw both at Computex, and they both immediately ticked all of the boxes. Tempered glass on every surface possible, vertical GPU mounts, minimal airflow in the front of the case, RGB LED fans, and then whatever other various sundries and accessories were found with cases at the time. This one came out to be $200. When we looked at them originally, the prices weren't final. So this is a $200 enclosure at this point. The Alpha 330 is $100, and it kills a lot of the smaller accessories and the visual elements of this case. So we'll look at this one, and then the review will pretty much apply to the other one outside of the price proposition. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by the Thermaltake Flow RGB closed loop liquid cooler, which is a 360mm radiator plus 3 120 fans that are RGB illuminated. The Thermaltake rain fans at that. This is a 4.5 Gen Aztec pump, which is one of the faster pumps. You can learn more at the link in the description below. So first off, the differences between the two cases before getting into it too much. The Alpha 550 contains a few pretty obvious changes. One is that it's physically larger. It also uses that extra size to accommodate this front door, which just pushes out like that and conceals the front I/O, including USB Type-C, something that a lot of cases lack. And this one isn't even an afterthought, like the Define R6 and several other cases, some of the Be Quiet ones as well, where you can see that they've basically commandeered a USB slot and stuck a USB Type-C port in there with a plastic shroud molded around it. This one accommodates it natively, so that's interesting, but that's only on the 550 model. You won't get the front I/O with the front I/O covered door on the 330. The front I/O is also accompanied by a difference in fan configuration. The 330 model only has a rear exhaust fan. It does not include the three 120mm RGB LED front intake fans. These fans make up a huge amount of the price. If you're wondering how a case that's only maybe an inch or two bigger in any dimension costs $100 more, it's not that I/O panel, and it's not the I/O cover either. It's those fans. Those fans, despite how effective they are functionally and practically, are expensive. If you look at them, they're actually, they're ensconced in metal. So the fans have metal shrouds around the outside and a thick plastic interior. It's not cheap to make something like that. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's good or bad. It means that it's expensive, which goes along with what Lian Li does. The reason that this case got so much attention when we first covered it and everyone else covered it at Computex is specifically because of that point. Lian Li makes expensive things. They are known for being basically unobtainable. This case at $200 is one of the most affordable cases Lian Li has ever made. That's saying something. So they've finally learned, wait a minute, aluminum is that expensive? What if we did steel? And they did steel. So they did steel, and then they said, you know, a case under $100 just feels wrong. So they added 4 tempered glass panels, some of which have the partial shrouding at the bottom, like this back one over here. The bottom quarter of it is actually shrouded in black. So they're doing that thing, except they're not applying it to the entire case like some of the other cases on the market are. The intake problem is something we'll talk about in the thermal section, but they've tried to compensate. This is a thing we need to talk about again. With cases that have a closed off front or a glass front, there is a natural trade-off. If you want your PC to look discreet or low profile, or you just like tempered glass a lot and you want the front finish on it, then you're going to trade off on airflow. You don't have to trade all of it. There can be changes made to the case to accommodate this. For example, spacing out the front panel to be about an inch away from the chassis will give those fans enough room to pull in some air from the side. You lose some pressure by nature of making multiple 90-degree turns in that process, but it will help out significantly with airflow despite being a closed-off face. Not every case does that on the market though. And it's not inherently bad to have a closed-off face. Just like anything else that's partially subjective or based on user scenarios, there are reasons you would want that. It doesn't mean that you need to buy the worst possible one, for example, the worst possible closed off front panel that has poor airflow, but you could buy something and sacrifice some airflow in exchange for having the visuals that you want. So with that kind of out of the way, what they've done here is, as expected at this point, closed off the front and sacrificed some airflow. We tested with the front panel removed to see just how much that was, but what I can tell you right now is that this ventilation on the side is very small. It's not really enough to help counteract the sort of sleekness or the visuals they're going for with that front panel. Not the worst we've seen this year, but you need a bit more space there to breathe, maybe some more space on the bottom, or even some cutout somewhere in the top would help out on the airflow front. The case does do a couple of things artistically. It's got the sort of diamond lattice front finish on it that's a bit new and different. And now that we have a case that's actually come whole, we can see what it looks like rather than the one that came in many shattered tiny glass pieces, but that was more the carrier's fault than Lian Li's fault. It doesn't look too bad. It just depends on who you are as a user. The RGB LEDs are really the main focal point here, as they are with most things at this point. But let's go through some of Patrick's build notes, and then we'll get to the thermal and noise section. First of all, on the build side, the Alpha 550 is, again, all glass externally. It's got thin strips of mesh at the top and the front, so both of those are a bit choked off, and it looks a bit like the BitPhoenix Shogun that we previously reviewed. There's minimal branding here, just a subtle etching at the bottom of the front panel and a couple of logos embossed on the interior, along with that diamond pattern on the backlit filters. Building in the Alpha 550 was pretty easy. There was a brief moment when it seemed like the hard drive cage was going to block the power supply from entering the case, like it did in the BitPhoenix Enso, but removing one thumb screw allows the entire hard drive cage to slide out easily. The front and top panels are held firmly enough to avoid danger, and there are enough wide filters clipped underneath to deal with any potential dust problems. The filter below the case slides out from the side, which is sadly brilliant and not something that a lot of case manufacturers do, so it's easier to access than those that slide out from the back, where you would have to basically pull your system away from the wall to get access to it. The side panels have nothing to catch them once the screws are removed, which should be standard by now in tempered glass cases. This is something where Thermaltake actually is ahead of the game, and so you just have to be a bit careful when removing the panels. There's a cable management shield behind the motherboard held in with heavy-duty hinges that helps squash the nest of RGB fan cables that you will ultimately have to combat. Many cases allow a space above the motherboard for fan and radiator mounting, but often it's separated from the rest of the case. In the 550, there are just a couple of inches of clearance above the motherboard, but it's ample for most radiators that we can think of aside from a couple of standouts, and it's still enough to allow for easy CPU power and other cable routing. This is impressive given that it shares tooling with the much shorter Alpha 330. There are cable cutouts in the motherboard tray, but they're at the very front of the case and are mostly useful for the fan cables. For everything else, there's an excellent cable management bar with cutouts for Velcro ties. It doesn't look like any cables would be able to fit beneath it, but there are cleverly placed cutouts that allow 24-pin ATX cables to pass through as well. The LED fans bundle 4 RGB and 3 PWM wires into a single plug, which is convenient in terms of cable management, but doesn't allow the fans to be connected to typical fan or RGB headers. Instead, they must be connected to Lian Li's controller. This controller seems like it's replaced an older design. There's only one screw hole, there should be 2, drilled into the case for it, and there's an empty spot on front I/O with a diagram of a button labeled RGB, but there's no actual button. This indicates to us that there was intended to be a button at some point in front I/O for RGB control. However, they replaced it with an actual controller, as in a remote controller. There's no mechanical control on the case, there's no software like CAM, it's just an LED color and pattern and speed button that you can adjust via remote. On the bright side, there's a lot of customization available, and there are some wild baked-in animations. The fans and LED strips sync well with each other for the most part. Our bottom fan was rotated 1 turn out of alignment, if you really care, and the use of the remote does allow for more detailed controls than the usual press button to change color. And besides, if your alternative is something like CAM, you're probably better off going with hardware. Fan speed is controlled via a PWM header attached to the motherboard, so the main benefit of bundling RGB, fan, and power together and connecting the fans to the hub is to reduce cable clutter. Lian Li's fans must be connected to Lian Li's controller, and that RGB controller must be controlled by Lian Li's included remote. The Bora 120 RGB fans are certainly well made from a physical material standpoint, ignoring the performance of them, and currently go for $40 on Amazon with the controller included. It's understandable that Lian Li would want their fans to be connected to their RGB controller to make sure they take full advantage of the individual addressable RGBs, but you do end up limited in where you can connect them. Let's get into thermals and noise. The Alpha 550 comes with 3 intake fans and 1 exhaust, so we didn't bother testing with extra fans or serious reconfiguration. Instead, we did the usual vertical GPU test. Spoiler, it's bad for an air-cooled card with an open face, and we also tested without the front panel to see how much it obstructs airflow. Starting with CPU torture tests, under the full system torture workload, CPU temperature averaged 60.4 degrees Celsius over ambient and 56.2 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient with the GPU mounted vertically. That's typical of cases we've tested, but the GPU typically reports a higher temperature in the vertical orientation, given that it's pushed up against a glass insulator. The reason the CPU temperature goes down in this configuration is primarily because we've removed some of the radiative heat coming off the backplate of the GPU, or at least relocated it, which will favor CPU temperatures marginally. With the front panel removed and the filter left in place, CPU temperature plummeted to 46.7 degrees Celsius delta over ambient. That degree of airflow limitation is to be expected in a case with so much glass, but it also shows what you're giving up in favor of a front glass panel. The difference, of course, comes down to whether the case is marketed as high airflow. In this case, it doesn't have marketing materials that lay claim to high airflow or high performance cooling, unlike the ENSO and H500P. It could, however, still use help in that department. The crazy thing here is that there's a 10-degree swing or more by removing the front panel. We're suffocating the CPU for airflow here. The case doesn't have to be fully redesigned. It can still have glass everywhere and can still have the Lian Li look. Just make more side ventilation on that front panel and make it a bit wider, give it some more breathing room at the bottom or the top, and you'll make up for a lot of that performance. With the front panel on, the 550 is around the BitPhoenix Shogun and the stock InWin 303 and CPU cooling. It's definitely warm, but Lian Li has been trying to make this somewhat of a functional case rather than exclusively a showpiece. It's still more towards showpiece though. The View 71 significantly lower CPU temperature of 54.7 degrees is the strongest direct competition to the 550, thanks to Thermaltake's offset glass panels that allow air to circulate all around the case. The Alpha 550 runs about the same as the Dark Base 700 with its Silent 3 setting, and 4 degrees warmer than the airflow marketed H500P. As for GPU temperature, that reached 52.3 degrees Celsius over ambient and torture testing, but overheated as usual when vertically oriented. With an average of about 10 degrees higher for 62 degrees when vertically oriented, we are starting to see Boost 3.0 lower the clocks a bit as it continues to climb. This isn't an inherent problem with the orientation being vertical itself, it's a problem with a typical case dimension and layout. We've tested every vertical mount option this year that's been afforded to us, and almost every single one of them pushes the GPU as close to the side panel as possible. That's done for a few reasons. One of them is looks, the other is getting the card away from the CPU cooler to allow for maximum clearance, but you're ultimately ending up with open face air cards against a giant glass insulator where there's no room for air to get into the card, and when it exits the card, it's got nowhere to go either, so you're just recirculating hot air. This configuration, as we've said in basically every video at this point, is primarily meant for open loop cooling. That doesn't mean everyone will use it that way, which is why we still test it with an open face card, to show you when not to use it. Open face cards are when not to use it. Actually, even blower cards aren't great. A bit better, but as you'll see in our disappointment PC build that we uploaded, still not great, still throttles. So ultimately, that's a configuration you use for open loop cooling, and that's about it. It looks nice, but doesn't work well with open face cards. Removing the front panel entirely only lowered GPU temperature 2 degrees to 50.1 degrees, meaning that the stock configuration is already close to the best case scenario, and boost functionality begins interfering anyway once we get into the hotter scenarios like vertical orientation. Stock GPU temperature was impressively cool relative to other cases, given that the restrictive front panel and the warm CPU temperatures were interfering with things. It's on par with the stock NZXT H700i and Thermaltake Core P3, both cases that performed well in our testing. Even the stock View 71 is less than 1 degree cooler. 60 loops of 3D Mark's Firestrike Extreme stress test warmed the GPU to 54.4 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient, another competitively cool score, so to speak. The Alpha 550 does surprisingly well on GPU thermals and is a factor of how the fans are aligned with the face of the card. The View 71 is again less than 1 degree cooler, and the H700i and Core P3 are again roughly equal. The three 120mm fans do a great job of pushing air along the bottom of the case to the GPU, which is top priority for those anyway. Blender rendering on the CPU caused CPU delta T to average 40.9 degrees Celsius, on the same end of the chart as sealed-off cases like the Thermaltake P8 and cases with half as many fans, like Fractal's Define C and Meshify C in stock configurations. There's a fan pushing air into the CPU cooler and another fan pulling air out, so this is the best the Alpha 550 can do stock without better fans, and it's just partly the distance of the cooler from the front of the panel. The air loses most of its pressure by the time it gets anywhere, and so we end up with slightly higher temperatures when working with an air cooler on the CPU. GPU rendering brought the GPU delta T to 26.6 degrees, still slightly warmer than the View 71, but not by much. Considering that the worst result, the Corsair Spec 04, was about 11 degrees higher, the 550 is definitely pulling its weight in the GPU cooling department overall. As for noise, this is a loud case, but that shouldn't be a surprise. There are a lot of fans. They're 120mm. They spin up to nearly 2,000 RPM, if the spec sheet is to be believed. And 40.4 dBA is audibly equivalent to the H700i and the View 71, both of which are near the top of the chart for noise levels, and by top here, that's generally worst, not best. The fans could be turned down for daily use, just make sure to turn them back up for thermal improvements when working with heavier workloads. The Alpha 550 is a lot like NZXT's H700i. It's a decent looking case if you're into that kind of thing, with pretty good build quality that's ultimately dragged down in terms of the price to performance value proposition by all of the accessories that are bundled into it. However, unlike NZXT's H700i, the Alpha 550 comes with a cheaper alternative, the Alpha 330. This is the one that we think is the most worth looking into. If you can forfeit that front panel, it's worth considering. It's $100 cheaper. The Alpha 330 at $100, basically flat, is actually a pretty good deal. The build quality of these cases is reasonably high. Yes, they're a bit warm, but that's kind of the point of buying the 330. You buy that, and then you buy better fans, and you resolve that issue for the most part entirely. So that's what we would recommend looking into the most. You could even get the fans for cheaper than the extra $100. Now, you lose a couple of things, but these Lian Li fans, again, are expensive and not necessarily for the reasons that drive performance. They look pretty good. You can find similar to better looking fans depending on how you feel about them. That's all subjective. And so if you can, it's worth doing and grabbing the smaller case. Again, you just lose some of this top. So if you want a top radiator, probably consider this one instead. As a case, the 550 isn't bad in terms of strictly its build quality. Its layout is even pretty good. It follows a lot of the trends without just being an outright copy like a lot of the other cases are right now. And it has at least somewhat unique tooling in here. This case is a genuine actual effort at making a good case, and that's nice to see. It is, however, very warm in its stock configuration for air-cooled components, so just consider that and make sure you plan accordingly with the rest of your build. The case does not claim that it is the best at air cooling. It doesn't claim that it has super high airflow, so you can only fault it so much because it's ultimately trying to be more of a showpiece that has high build quality to some extent. So we do like the case, but it does have a lot of competition. The Alpha 330 is more of what we would point you toward if you like this one. It's basically the same, and it's a lot cheaper. That one competes with the S340 Elite, and it's pretty competitive in that category. This one competes with things like the Darkbase Pro 900, big, a bit different audience, but certainly a strong competitor. It competes with the NZXT H700i, which despite its smart controller, we do like quite a lot, but not the smart controller. And it competes with a couple of other cases, Darkbase 700, and it's fighting some other enclosures up there at the top of the list as well. View 71 isn't too far away, a bit cheaper, similar glass focus. So there's actually a lot of competition this year at $200, and that makes it hard for this one to win. We do, however, like the price proposition of the Alpha 330, and if you don't like the alternatives to this one, subjectively speaking, then, well, you're left with that one. So for more information on this, check the article linked in the description below for the full review written by Patrick. If you'd like to help us out directly, go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, or you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a mod mat like this one or a shirt like this one. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.